The scent of bleach and lemon was my only companion, a familiar perfume that clung to my clothes and hair long after I'd clocked out. It was the smell of survival, of rent paid just in time, of another day scraped through. My tiny, walk-up apartment was a world away from the gleaming towers I cleaned, a place of second-hand furniture and dreams I was starting to fear would never come true. I'd spend my nights looking out my smudged window at the city lights, wondering what it was like to live in one of them instead of just cleaning up after the people who did. The 64th floor of the Omnicorp Tower was a ghost town after midnight, a silent world of glass and steel suspended over the glittering, indifferent heart of the city. My reflection, a tired woman of 25 with eyes that had seen too much exhaustion and not enough life, moved with me across the polished marble. I was mopping my way toward the executive washroom when the first sound cut through the sterile quiet. It wasn't loud, a muffled thud, like a heavy book falling from a great height. I froze, my hands tightening on the mop handle. The building's security was legendarily tight, but my heart, a frantic bird in my chest, didn't seem to care about legends. I told myself it was nothing. It was always nothing. But then came the second sound, a low, guttural curse in a language I didn't recognize, followed by a sickeningly wet crack. This time, I didn't hesitate. I dropped the mop, its clatter unnaturally loud in the silence, and ducked behind a large marble planter, my breath catching in my throat. The elevator at the far end of the hall chimed its arrival. The doors slid open, not with the gentle whisper of a corporate conveyance, but with a harsh, metallic clang. 3 men spilled out, their movements sharp and predatory. They were not executives. Their suits were too sharp, their shoulders too broad, and the bulges beneath their jackets were not wallets. They dragged a 4th man between them, his expensive shoes scuffing trails of blood on my freshly cleaned floor. They were speaking in rapid, angry Russian, and though I couldn't understand the words, the intent was universal. Violence was a language all its own. They forced the man to his knees before the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city. He was begging, his voice thick with terror. I pressed myself smaller, my cheeks scraping against the rough ceramic of the planter, praying to a god I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. Be invisible. Be nothing. The leader of the group pulled a gun, a dark, ugly thing that seemed to absorb the light. I squeezed my eyes shut, but you can't unhear a gunshot. It was deafening in the enclosed space, a final, brutal punctuation mark that echoed in the sudden, ringing silence. When I dared to open my eyes, the man was gone, and there was a spiderweb of cracks in the reinforced glass. A dark stain was spreading across the marble. I must have made a sound, a choked gasp, a whimper. The leader's head snapped in my direction. His eyes, pale and cold as a winter sky, locked onto mine. There was no surprise in them, only annoyance, the look of a man spotting a roach in his pristine kitchen. He raised the gun. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. I saw the dark circle of the barrel, the slight curl of his lip. This was it. This was how my story, the quiet, unremarkable story of Anya, ended. But before he could fire, the main office doors behind me burst open. Figures in black, silent and fluid, swarmed into the hallway. The Russians barely had time to react before the air was filled with the soft, suppressed coughs of silenced firearms. It was over in seconds. A massacre executed with chilling precision. The pale-eyed man fell last, his expression of cold annoyance finally replaced by one of genuine shock. I remained frozen, a statue of terror, as the silence returned, heavier and more menacing than before. A pair of immaculate black leather shoes stopped in front of my hiding place. I slowly, fearfully, lifted my gaze, past the perfectly tailored trousers and expensive black suit jacket, to a crisp white collared shirt, and then to a face that was a mask of cold, devastating beauty. His name, I would learn, was Kong Min-jun. His dark eyes held no warmth, only a calculating assessment. He looked at the carnage, then back at me, his witness, crumpled and trembling. He saw my worn-out uniform, my terrified eyes, but He must have seen something else too, a flicker of defiance in the face of death. "You have a choice," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble that did nothing to soothe the frantic beating of my heart. "You can be a liability that needs to be erased. A loose end. Or you can be an asset that I own. Marry me." The silk of the wedding dress felt like a shroud. It was a couture creation, heavy with thousands of seed pearls that whispered against my skin with every terrified breath. I stood before a wall of mirrors in a suite larger than my entire apartment, a place of gilded opulence and silent menace. A woman I didn't know, with a face as impassive as stone, was adjusting the veil, her fingers deft and cold. She was one of his people. Everyone here was one of his people. I was the only foreign object in this perfectly curated world, a bird with broken wings placed in a golden cage. Looking at my reflection, I saw a stranger, a beautiful, haunted doll with wide, dark eyes and skin that glowed like polished mahogany against the stark white of the gown. This was the asset. Not Anya, the cleaner who dreamed of opening a small bookstore where people could find quiet refuge, but a piece on a chessboard, a beautiful prop for a deadly game. This wasn't a wedding, it was an acquisition. The ceremony was a blur of tradition and terror. It took place in a private chapel on his estate, a place of soaring stone arches and stained glass that depicted solemn, judging saints. The pews were not filled with friends and family, but with his lieutenants, men with hard faces and watchful eyes, their dark suits a funereal contrast to my bridal white. Their loyalty was a palpable force in the room, a silent, unshakable vow to the powerful Korean Mafia boss who stood at the altar, waiting for me. Kang Min-jun looked like a king in his bespoke tuxedo. He stood with an unnerving stillness, a predator at rest. As my hand, cold and trembling, was placed in his grip was firm, possessive, a silent reminder of our arrangement. He did not smile. His gaze swept over me, analytical and detached, as if checking a recent acquisition for flaws. The vows were a mockery, a string of sacred words rendered meaningless by the circumstances. When he slid the ring onto my finger, a band of platinum impossibly heavy with a diamond the size of a thumbnail, it felt less like a symbol of love and more like a beautifully crafted manacle. His touch was brief, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt of awareness through me, a spark of heat in the icy landscape of my fear. After the sterile ceremony, we were left alone in his study. It was a dark, masculine room, paneled in mahogany and smelling of old books and whiskey. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the light as he swirled it in the crystal glass. He didn't offer me one. I was not a guest. "Let us be clear," he said, turning to face me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "This marriage means nothing. It is a contract, a strategic maneuver to quiet the questions about the incident you witnessed. The Russian syndicate who saw you are under the impression you are now under my protection, as my wife. It makes you an untouchable target, and it gives me, a powerful man in my position, a convenient reason to have eliminated them. It is clean." He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "You are a business asset. You will live in my house, where my clothes bear my name. In return, you will breathe. You will be loyal. You will be silent, and you will be obedient. Do you understand your role, Anya?" The way he said my name, the first time he had spoken it since that night, was like the flick of a whip. It was a claim. I could only nod, my throat too tight to form words. He saw the tears threatening to spill from my eyes, and a flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps impatience, crossed his features. "Tears are useless here," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously soft tone. "You are no longer the frightened girl on the floor. You are the wife of a powerful mafia boss. You are my wife. Start acting like it." He placed the glass down with a decisive click. "You are Mrs. Kang now. Remember that." Life in Kang Min-jun's mansion was a lesson in contradictions. It was a fortress disguised as a palace, a cage wrought from marble and gold. Every surface gleamed, every room was filled with priceless art, and from my bedroom window, I had a staggering view of the city that was now my prison. I was surrounded by a silent, efficient staff who catered to my every need before I could even voice it, yet I had never felt more alone. They were polite, deferential, but their eyes were always watching. They were his eyes. If I asked a simple question about my husband's day, they would offer a polite, empty smile and change the subject. My days fell into a strange, suspended rhythm. I would wake in a bed large enough for 6, eat meals prepared by a personal chef in a dining room that could host a state dinner, and wander the cavernous, silent halls of my new home. Min-jun was a phantom. He left before I woke and returned long after I had retreated to my room. Our only interactions were brief, perfunctory collisions in a hallway or a shared, silent moment in his study where he worked and I sat, reading a book, the silence between us thick with unspoken tension. I once saw him through the crack of the door on a video call, his Korean sharp and unforgiving. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a commander, and the man on the other end of the screen was visibly shrinking under the force of his authority. He was the architect of my confinement, yet I found myself studying him. I noticed the way his iron control frayed ever so slightly when he was deep in thought, a muscle feathering in his jaw. I saw the deep-seated weariness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking as he stared out the window into the night. I learned that he preferred black tea, that he never touched sweets, and that he had a faint, almost invisible scar bisecting his left eyebrow. These small, human details were terrifying because they made him real, more than just the monster who had bought my life. I began to test the boundaries of my gilded cage. One afternoon, I walked out into the meticulously manicured gardens, breathing in the scent of rain-soaked earth and roses. I walked toward the high stone walls that enclosed the property, my heart beginning to pound with a wild, foolish hope. I had made it almost to the gate when Mr. Choi, his ever-present, stoic lieutenant, seemed to materialize from the shadows. "Mrs. Kong," he said, his voice respectful but firm. "It is not safe for you to be out here alone." The master would be displeased, the message was clear. I was not to leave. I turned back, the fight draining out of me. That evening, Min-jun found me in the library, a vast, 2-story room that was the only place in the house that felt like a sanctuary. I was curled in a leather armchair, a book lying forgotten in my lap. "You went to the gate today," he stated, not a question. I didn't answer, my silence a small rebellion. "Do not do it again," he continued, his voice low and devoid of heat, which was somehow more frightening. "The men I killed to protect you have friends. They believe you are my weakness. The moment you step outside that wall, you are dead. And your death would be an inconvenience I do not have time for." His words were cruel, designed to remind me of my status as an object, an inconvenience. But as he turned to leave, he paused. "The East Wing is off limits. Everywhere else is yours." It wasn't kindness, but it was a concession. A crack in the bars of my cage. Later that night, a maid entered my room with a tray. On it was a plate of warm, freshly baked madeleines and a steaming cup of chamomile tea. "The master thought you might be hungry," she said softly, avoiding my eyes. I stared at the tray long after she left. He had noticed my uneaten dinner. He had remembered a passing comment I'd made weeks ago to a housekeeper about my love for French pastry. This small, almost imperceptible act of observation was more unsettling than any of his threats. The monster had been watching, and he had seen something more than just an asset. He had seen me. A week later, he announced our departure. "Pack a bag. We're leaving in the morning," he said, finding me in the conservatory among the orchids. He offered no further explanation. He simply stated it as fact and walked away, the expectation of my compliance hanging in the humid air. The word, honeymoon, was never spoken, but the implications were clear. This was a public performance, another move in his grand, violent game. We were to present the image of a newly married couple, solidifying the lie that bound us. The destination was a private villa on a secluded stretch of the California coastline, a place of dramatic rock and turquoise water. It was breathtakingly beautiful, an idyllic paradise that felt like a cruel joke given our circumstances. The flight on his private jet was silent and tense. I sat across from him, pretending to read a novel, but my eyes kept drifting up to watch the powerful Korean Mafia boss at work. His laptop was open, his phone pressed to his ear as he issued a stream of clipped, ruthless commands in Korean. He was a man constantly at war, and I was his latest acquisition of territory. The villa was a marvel of modern architecture, a structure of glass and dark wood built into the cliffside, overlooking the sea. It was isolated, defensible, and utterly inescapable. As his men, led by the ever-watchful Mr. Choi, swept the property and secured the perimeter, Min-jun led me inside. "This will be our home for the next week," he said, his tone flat. "The staff is local and has been vetted. You will not speak of our arrangement. You are my wife. You will act the part." My defiance, which had been simmering just beneath the surface of my fear, finally boiled over. "And what part is that, exactly?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "The adoring bride? The happy newlywed? What kind of performance do you expect me to give? Am I supposed to gaze at you lovingly over breakfast while your men stand guard with guns?" He turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw something other than cold calculation in his eyes. It was a flicker of raw anger, a dangerous fire that he quickly banked. He stepped closer, invading my space, and I had to fight the instinct to retreat. "You will act like a woman who wishes to stay alive," he whispered, his voice a silken threat. "You are intelligent, Anya. I know you are. Do not make the mistake of being foolish." He walked away, leaving me trembling, a mixture of fear and fury churning in my gut. Later that day, as I stood on the balcony, staring out at the endless expanse of the ocean, he came to stand beside me. The sea breeze whipped a strand of my hair across my face, and before I could react, his hand came up, his fingers gently brushing it away. The touch was electric, a shocking moment of intimacy that felt more dangerous than any of his threats. He didn't pull away immediately. His thumb grazed my cheekbone, his gaze intense, searching my face for something I couldn't name. "My enemies are watching," he murmured, his voice so low it was almost lost in the sound of the waves. "They think you are my vulnerability. They see a soft, frightened woman. They are waiting for me to be distracted by my new bride." He finally dropped his hand and turned his gaze to the horizon. "Let them watch." That night, he entered my room and placed a small, heavy object on the nightstand. It was a handgun, compact and deadly. I stared at it, my blood running cold. "What is this?" I whispered. "I do not expect you will need this," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "My men are the best, but I do not like leaving things to chance. Why are you giving this to me? You think I won't use it on you?" His eyes met mine, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "A cornered animal is more dangerous than a loyal one. I am giving you the choice of which to be. It is a Sig Sauer. The safety is here. You point it, and you pull the trigger. Do not hesitate. This was my honeymoon gift, a piece of steel and death." It was a terrifying gesture, but it was also something else. The first time he had ever trusted me with anything. The attack came on the third night, under the cover of a raging thunderstorm. The sky had turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf against the glass walls of the villa. The power cut out suddenly, plunging the world into a disorienting darkness, broken only by the frantic, strobe-like flashes of lightning. In that first split second of blackness, I knew it wasn't a simple power outage. It was a prelude. The sharp crack of unsilenced gunfire from the perimeter confirmed it, a sound that ripped through the roar of the storm. Min-jun was across the living room from me in an instant, his body a solid wall of muscle, pushing me down behind a thick marble sofa. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal growl in my ear. The casual elegance was gone, replaced by the coiled lethality of a predator. He already had his own weapon in his hand, moving with a fluid grace that was terrifying to behold. The sounds of a fierce, close-quarters battle erupted throughout the house, shouts, the splintering of wood, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor. Mr. Choi and the other guards were fighting back, but our attackers had come in force. They had used the storm as cover, a classic, brutal tactic. A flash of lightning illuminated a figure smashing through the glass doors of the balcony. He was huge, dressed in black tactical gear, a Russian rifle in his hands. Min-jun didn't hesitate. 2 suppressed shots, precise and economical, and the man crumpled to the ground. But another came right behind him. A bullet ricocheted off the marble fireplace, sending chips of stone flying past my head. I could hear Min-jun grunt in pain, a sharp, ragged sound. In the next flash of lightning, I saw it. A dark stain spreading across the sleeve of his white shirt, just below the shoulder. He was hit. He stumbled slightly, firing back, but his movements were a fraction slower. The invaders were closing in, their goal clear: get to him. Get to the boss. They saw him as wounded, and me as nothing, a terrified woman cowering behind a couch. They were right about the terrified part. My entire body was shaking, my teeth chattering. But as I watched Min-jun fight, bleeding, protecting the space around me, something else rose through the fear. It was a white-hot primal rage. They were trying to kill him. This man who owned me, who had caged me, who had shown me a sliver of something almost human. He was mine, in his own twisted way. And they were not going to take him. My mind went to the gun upstairs. The honeymoon gift. Scrabbling on my hands and knees, keeping low, I moved away from the firefight, using the darkness and chaos as cover. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat a deafening drum. I flew up the stairs, my bare feet silent on the cold stone. I found the gun on the nightstand, my hand closing around the cool, heavy metal. It felt alien, but my fingers found the grip, the trigger, just as he'd shown me. A man appeared at the top of the stairs, blocking my path back down. He saw me, a woman in a silk nightgown holding a gun, and he laughed. It was a fatal mistake. He thought I was a damsel. Aprop. He raised his rifle, too slowly, too arrogantly. I didn't think. I didn't aim, in any classical sense. I just pointed. The image of Min-jun falling burned into my mind, and I pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil jarring my arm to the shoulder. The man stared at me, his eyes wide with shock, a dark hole appearing in his chest. He fell backward, tumbling down the stairs. I didn't wait to watch him land. I scrambled back down, my ears ringing. In the main room, Min-jun was pinned down, 2 men advancing on his position. He saw me, and for a single, infinite moment, his face registered pure, unadulterated shock. He froze. He saw the gun in my hand, the wild look in my eyes, the blood that wasn't mine splattered on my gown. It was the last thing he, or anyone, had ever expected. That moment of hesitation, his and his enemies, was all I needed. I raised the gun and fired again. And again. The ordinary, financially struggling woman was gone, burned away in gunpowder and desperation. In her place was a queen, drenched in the storm, defending her king. The world came back into focus slowly, filtered through the ringing in my ears and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The storm outside still raged, a fitting soundtrack to the carnage within. The bodies of our attackers lay twisted on the expensive rugs. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the gun, its weight a terrible, anchoring reality. My gaze was fixed on Min-jun. He was leaning against the fireplace, his face pale, his breathing shallow. But his eyes were on me, and the look in them was something I had never seen before. The cold calculation was gone, the commanding arrogance had vanished. In its place was a raw, staggering astonishment that seemed to shake him to his very core. He looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time, not as an asset or a contract, but as a terrifying and magnificent revelation. He had expected me to hide, to perhaps use the gun in a last, desperate act of self-preservation. He had never imagined I would charge back into the fight to defend him. His trusted men, Mr. Choi among them, were now securing the room, their movements swift and professional, but their gazes kept flicking towards me with a mixture of awe and fear. I was no longer the fragile foreign wife. I was the woman who had stood her ground while the world burned down around her. I let the gun fall from my nerveless fingers. It clattered loudly on the stone floor. The sound broke the spell. Minjun pushed himself off the mantelpiece, hissing in pain as the movement jarred his wounded shoulder. He ignored his men and came directly to me, his steps unsteady. He stopped in front of me, his height and presence still overwhelming, but the dynamic between us had irrevocably fractured and reformed. He reached out, not with the possessive grip of a master, but with a trembling hand, and cupped my cheek. His thumb stroked my skin, gently trying to wipe away the flecks of blood that weren't mine. "Anya," he breathed, my name a prayer and a question on his lips. His other hand went to my arm, his grip urgent, as if he needed to assure himself I was real. His eyes scanned me from head to toe, checking for injuries I hadn't even registered. It was only then, under his frantic gaze, that I realized the depth of his shock was rooted in fear. Fear for me. The powerful Mafia boss who had declared our marriage meaningless was terrified of losing me. I started to tremble then, the adrenaline deserting me, leaving behind a hollow, quaking horror at what I had done. My knees gave way, but he caught me, pulling me against his chest, his uninjured arm wrapping around me like a steel band. He held me tightly, tucking my head under his chin, his body a shield against the dead men and the storm. "I have you," he murmured into my hair, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't name. "Sarang. I have you." I didn't know what the word meant, but in the shelter of his arms, with the scent of his skin and his blood filling my senses, I felt the first stirrings of a dangerous, terrifying truth. I had not killed to save my own life. I had killed to save his. And in that violent, bloody moment, the contract had been broken, and something far more binding had been forged in its place. We never spoke of the gunshots or the bodies. His men were ghosts, cleaning the chaos with silent, chilling efficiency until the villa was once again a pristine, beautiful prison. The only evidence of the night's violence, the boarded-up glass doors and the lingering scent of disinfectant. Mr. Choi, a man I had only ever seen as a stoic statue, brought me a glass of brandy with a hand that was not entirely steady and a look of profound, unnerving respect in his eyes. He addressed me as Samanam, a title of honor for the wife of a chairman, and the word held a new weight, a new truth. Minjun had refused a doctor, barking orders at his men that he was fine, but the blood seeping through the makeshift bandage on his arm told a different story. I found him in his bathroom, stripped to the waist, trying and failing to clean the wound himself. His face was tight with pain, a sheen of sweat on his brow. The man who controlled a criminal empire couldn't manage a simple piece of gauze. For the first time since I'd met him, I felt no fear, only a fierce, protective ache in my chest. I took the medical kit from his hands. He started to protest, his pride warring with his pain, but I met his gaze in the mirror, and the defiance died on his lips. "Sit down, Minjun," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. He stared at me for a long moment, this formidable Mafia boss, and then he did as he was told, sinking onto the edge of the marble bathtub. I worked in silence, my hands surprisingly steady as I cleaned the wound. It was a deep graze, ugly and raw, the bullet having torn through flesh and muscle. He never flinched, but I could feel the tension radiating from his body, the tight control he exerted over his own pain. My fingers were gentle as I applied the antiseptic, as I stitched the torn skin with a neatness I didn't know I possessed. His skin was warm beneath my touch, the expanse of his back and shoulders a landscape of taut muscle and old scars. Each one told a story I didn't know, a history of violence that had shaped him. When I was done, my hands lingered on his uninjured shoulder. He was so still, he might as well have been carved from stone. "They underestimated you," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through my hand. "They saw you as a trinket, a weakness." He finally turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "So did I. That was my mistake." He reached up and captured my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. His grip was no longer a claim of ownership, but a connection, a desperate hold. "That marriage contract. The words I spoke in my study. They were a lie. His voice was raw, stripped of all its usual authority. It was a lie to myself. From the moment I saw you hiding behind that planter, so terrified but with so much fire in your eyes, you were never just an asset. He paused, and I saw a vulnerability in him that was more shocking than the gunfight. Tonight, he said, his voice barely a whisper, when I saw you with that gun in your hand, covered in blood, I wasn't shocked that you could kill. I was frozen with the realization that I could not bear to lose you, that my life means nothing if you are not in it. The confession hung in the air between us, more explosive than any gunshot. Kong Min-jun was admitting to a weakness, and he was naming it me. Our return to the city was a silent declaration of a new regime. We walked off his private jet side by side, not as master and possession, but as partners. His arm was in a black silk sling, a visible sign of the battle that had been won, and his hand rested possessively on the small of my back, a public claim that felt entirely different now. It was not a warning to me, but a warning to the world. She is mine. Touch her and die. The staff at the mansion lined up to greet us, their heads bowed low. But this time, their eyes, when they dared to look at me, were filled with a deference that bordered on reverence. The story of a honeymoon had traveled faster than we had. I was no longer the frightened bride. I was the Salmonim who had defended the master, the woman who had met violence with violence. I was a queen who had earned her crown in blood. Min-jun led me directly to his study, the heart of his empire. But instead of leaving me to my books, he gestured for me to sit in the leather chair opposite his desk, the one reserved for his most trusted advisors. Mr. Choi entered, placing a tablet on the desk. The remaining Bratva leadership responsible for the attack, Min-jun said, his voice cold as ice as he swiped through images of grim-faced Russian men. They thought to send a message by targeting my home, my wife. They have exposed their entire command structure in the process. A foolish, emotional move. He looked at me, his eyes searching my face. They will be eliminated. All of them. There will be no half measures. I want you to understand the world you are a part of now, Anya. There is no going back. I looked at the faces on the screen, men who had wanted me dead, who had hurt him. I felt no pity. Only a cold, hard certainty. I understand, I said, my voice clear and steady. They made the mistake of thinking your wife was a weakness. Show them she is your greatest strength. A slow, dangerous smile touched Min-jun's lips for the very first time. It transformed his face, making him look both devastatingly handsome and utterly lethal. Indeed. From that day forward, my education began. He no longer shielded me from his life. He immersed me in it. He explained the complex web of his businesses, both legitimate and illicit. He taught me about logistics, about finances, about loyalty and betrayal. I sat in on his meetings with his lieutenants, a silent presence at first. One day, discussing a rival's shipping routes, he paused the meeting and turned to me. "What do you see?" he asked. His men looked confused. I pointed to the schedule. The security patrols are weakest during the early morning shift change, but that's a decoy. The cargo of value is never on those trucks. It moves with the food service deliveries. No one ever checks the catering vans. Min-jun's smile was predatory. My quiet, observant nature, once a tool for survival as an invisible cleaner, was now a formidable weapon. I was becoming more than his wife. I was becoming his partner, his confidant, his secret weapon. The gilded cage had transformed into a throne room, and I was finally learning the language of power. The nights became our sanctuary. The brutal, high-stakes world would fall away, and in the quiet of the mansion, we would find each other. The fear that had once defined my existence was replaced by a sense of belonging so profound it frightened me more than any assassin's bullet. He had never been a man of easy words or grand romantic gestures. His love was shown in actions. It was in the way he would have the chef prepare my favorite Nigerian jollof rice just because he knew it reminded me of a home I no longer missed. It was in the way he would find me in the library and simply sit with me in silence, his presence a comforting weight, a silent promise that I was no longer alone. It was in the heightened security, the armored cars, the constant presence of his guards, not to confine me, but to build an impenetrable fortress around me. One evening, I found him standing in the East Wing, the one part of the house he had forbidden me from entering. The door was open. He turned as I approached, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "Come," he said, holding out his hand. The wing was not another opulent set of rooms. It was a nursery. It was furnished not for a baby, but for a child, with a small bed, shelves of classic books in both Korean and English, and a beautifully carved wooden horse. It was all covered in a fine layer of dust, a room frozen in time. "I had a younger sister," he said, his voice thick with an old, unhealed grief. "Her name was Sujin. She was everything good in this world. Our parents were killed when I was 19, and I took over the family business. I tried to protect her from it, to keep her world clean." He ran a hand over the wooden horse. "She loved this horse. She'd pretend she was a knight riding into battle. The Bratva, the same organization from the villa. They targeted her to get to me. She was 16-inch. He didn't need to finish the story. The unbearable sadness in the room told the rest of it. This was the source of his coldness, the reason he had tried to keep me at a distance, to treat me as nothing more than an asset. He had been terrified of history repeating itself, of loving someone only to have them torn away as a consequence of his life. "She's why I built these walls so high," he whispered, turning to me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I failed her. I will not fail you." I stepped into his arms, my own heart aching for the boy he had been and the man he had been forced to become. I held him, offering what little comfort I could. "You haven't failed me, Minjun," I murmured into his chest. "You've given me a home." He held me tighter, burying his face in my hair. "You," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You are my home, Anya. My sarang. My everything." In that dusty, silent room filled with ghosts, we found our truth. We were two broken people, forged in violence and loss, who had somehow found a way to make each other whole. His love wasn't gentle or poetic. It was fierce, possessive, and absolute. And I, in turn, loved him with a terrifying intensity, a love born in fear and baptized in blood. Months later, we stood on the 64th floor of the Omnicorp Tower. The space was no longer a sterile corporate hallway, but part of Minjun's private penthouse suite, the entire floor now belonging to him. We stood before the same floor-to-ceiling window, the one that had once borne the spiderweb cracks of a gunshot. It was seamless now, offering an unbroken, godlike view of the city glittering below. I was no longer in a cleaner's uniform, but a bespoke gown of deep crimson silk that clung to my body. A heavy diamond necklace, a gift from my husband, rested against my collarbone, its coolness a familiar weight. Minjun stood behind me, his arms wrapped around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. His presence was no longer a threat, but the center of my universe, the anchor that kept me steady. The last of the Bratva leadership in the city had been dealt with that afternoon. The news had been delivered by Mr. Choi with a simple, respectful nod. It was over. The threat was gone. We were safe. "Do you ever think about that night?" I asked softly, my reflection a stranger's, a powerful, confident woman I was still getting to know. "The first time we met, right here?" "I think about it every day," he murmured, his lips brushing against my temple. "I think about the terrified woman with the heart of a lioness. I think about how I almost made the greatest mistake of my life by letting you go." He tightened his grip, pulling me more firmly against his chest. "I built an empire of money and fear, Anya. But it was empty. It was a fortress with nothing inside to protect." He turned me in his arms, his dark eyes intense, filled with a deep, consuming love that still stole my breath away. "You are the heart of this empire. You are its queen. Everything I have, everything I am, is yours." I reached up and traced the faint scar on his eyebrow, a small imperfection on his perfect face. The timid, Lonely woman I had been would have been horrified by this life, by the violence and the darkness. She would have run. But I was not her anymore. I had been forged anew in the crucible of his world, and I had not been found wanting. I had discovered a strength I never knew I possessed, a capacity for ruthlessness that matched his own, and a love so powerful it had become my religion. "This marriage means nothing," I whispered, echoing the cruel words he had spoken on our wedding day, but my tone was a teasing caress. A slow, breathtaking smile spread across his face, the one reserved only for me. "No," he corrected, leaning down to capture my lips in a kiss that was both a promise and a prayer. "This marriage means everything," and as I looked out at the city lights spread beneath us like a carpet of fallen stars, I knew he was right. I was Anya Kong, wife of a king, and this dark, dangerous, beautiful kingdom was mine.